Good morning. We've got a new family to introduce to you today. We have a picture of them here. David and Lisa Planky, are you here today? Yes, right here. Grateful for you coming to be a part of our family. And while this is summer and we don't have life groups, I really want to encourage you to get involved in a life group this fall. It'll help you to have a more close-knit family around you to support you, and I want to encourage you in that. Now, this Wednesday night, we're beginning our summer series, and we've got a good slate of speakers for you this year. Some new faces, many old faces. We begin this week, though, with a really cute face because it's my oldest son. And so I really want to encourage you to come be a part of that this Wednesday night. We meet in the family room, and I think you'll be blessed by coming and being a part of that. So we're in this study of the book of Judges, and you know, as I read through Judges, sometimes I imagine it being made into a movie and that I get to actually cast the movie. And I think if I did that, you know, we talked about Othniel a few weeks ago. I think for Othniel, I'd probably pick Russell Crowe. And Ehud, you know, Ehud had a little bit of treachery involved in him, like Clint Eastwood usually does. You know, he's usually the hero of the story, but yet there's always that twist of treachery also. And when it comes to Shamgar, hey, got to be Sylvester Stallone, right? And in a few weeks, we're going to be looking at Samson. There's only one guy that can be Samson, Arnold Schwarzenegger. That brings us to our study for this week. We're going to be looking at Gideon. No doubt Don Knotts has got to be the guy. You've heard the old saying, you don't judge a book by its cover. That holds true in the case of Gideon. But I have changed that a little bit, and it's the title of my lesson today, and I think you'll understand why as we get through the story if you don't already. But I would change that to say, you don't book a judge by its cower. So we're in chapter 6, if you're following along in your Bibles, Judges chapter 6, and it begins like this. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Same song, 5th verse. I mean, we've already heard this a number of times in the book of Judges, right? Well, hang on because you're going to hear it a number of times more. It's a repeated refrain throughout this book. And so it goes on then to say, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock in their tents like swarms of locusts. In other words, they were like the IRS. But they aren't interested in political control. What they seem to be interested in is only exploiting the Israelites. And so it then goes on to say, it was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet. Now, I want to just pause right there. He sent them a prophet. Wait a minute. They cry out for deliverance, and he sends them a prophet. That'd be like if you broke down on the side of the road and you call AAA, and instead of sending a tow truck for you, they send out a pamphlet on safe driving. But Israel's problem is that they don't recognize that they are the problem. And so they need a prophet to put things in proper perspective for them. And so God says through his prophet, go to the next slide, please. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I'm the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me. Just stay on that slide. Thanks. They need to learn the lesson that the psalmist learned. You see, the psalmist learned this lesson, Psalm 119 and verse 67. It says, before I was afflicted, I went astray. In other words, it was the affliction that helped to bring the psalmist back. And he says, but now I obey your word. And you know what? Some of us are there right now. Some of us want God to deliver us from a situation, maybe deliver us from a relationship. Some of us want to get a new job. Some of us want to find a boyfriend or a girlfriend. But God says, what I need to do to your heart is more important than any of those things. God doesn't allow us to experience hardship because he's paying us back. God sometimes allows us to experience hardship so that he can bring us back. But get this. This is hard for us to wrap our heads around. God doesn't wait until Israel gets their act together before he delivers them. So it says in the first part of verse 11, the angel of the Lord came. Now this is a much more gracious response than you or I might have for someone who is continually hurting us, who does not make any apology for it, and who is going to continue to do it. Here we see this tension again that I mentioned early on in our study of Judges. This tension that God will never compromise on his holiness, nor will he ever compromise on his grace. You see, we often emphasize one at the expense of the other. We go to one extreme or the other. But listen, there is nothing amazing about grace as long as there is no fear in holiness. And the only way to hold these two together is to understand more deeply the cross of Jesus Christ, where these two come together so gloriously. Paul describes it with these words in Romans chapter 3 and verse 26. He describes God as just and the one who justifies. And this happens at the cross. So verse 11 then goes on to say, the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. A winepress is a poor place to thresh wheat. Usually wine presses were in a cave or underground. And with wheat, you need to beat the wheat up, and then you throw it up in the air so that the wind can blow away the chaff, and the heavier grain falls to the threshing floor. So why is Gideon threshing wheat in a wine press? Because he's Don Knotts. Because he's scared. He's not Clint Eastwood, okay? But God does not book a judge by his cower. And so verse 12 says, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Now, if this were a play or a movie, this is where the audience would laugh. Mighty warrior, Gideon? Is the angel mocking God? Some people think so. Some scholars think so. I don't. In fact, I want to tell you, I think this may be the most important lesson for us to get out of this story today. It's not on your outline, but this may be the most important lesson. And it's this: God does not speak to Gideon based on what Gideon was or even who Gideon is. God speaks to Gideon on the basis of what God is going to make him. God is not called, or Gideon is not called because he is courageous. Rather, he's made courageous as a result of his call. Now, this is really important for us to believe about ourselves, too. This is true about us in our standing with God. When God calls us, God does not see us or define us by our past or even by our present. God defines us by what He is going to make us through Jesus Christ. Now, who today is here that thinks that's good news? Oh, good. We've got about a dozen people in here that think that's good news. Do I need to preach on this more? I mean, this is important that we get this. So Gideon responds with two questions. The first one is, he says, "Pardon me, my Lord, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?" Now, based on what we have just read, this question is totally wrong-headed. Because has God left His people? No, His people have left Him. But then the second question is even more confusing, maybe. He says, where are all His wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, "Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." Gideon is saying, God, why don't you do great things anymore? And this is where I would like to be able to reach back through the ages and whisper into Gideon's ear and say, Gideon, do you not realize that sitting right in front of you is God in person? How can you ask such a question as that? Here's God's answer to him, verse 14. The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand." And then these next 5 words, I want you to underline, I want you to emblazon them on your mind. They are crucial for us when he says, "Am I not sending you?" I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit there. There's something else I want you emblazoned on your mind. Am I not sending you? You see, God saying, Gideon, you ask where my wonderful deeds are that I used to work among my people. Well, Gideon, you hang on because I'm getting ready to work them through you. Verse 15 says, "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family." Gideon says, I'm from a wimpy clan, and I'm the wimpiest of the wimpy. And he says, for crying out loud, I'm threshing wheat in a wine press. Verse 16, this is the words I want you to emblazon on your mind. The Lord answered, I will be with you. No, go back, please. And you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. I will be with you. Oh, brothers and sisters, we're going to face all kinds of things in life, but that's really all we need. That is all we need, to know that the Lord is with us. So verse 17 says, Gideon replied, if now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. And so the angel tells Gideon to go prepare a meal. And Gideon does. He brings that meal out before the angel. the angel takes his staff and touches the meal. Fire flashes up from the rock, consumes the meal, and the angel disappears. And Gideon comes to the realization that he has been face to face with God, and as a result of that, he builds an altar. Now I want you to skip down with me to verse 25. That same night, the Lord said to him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering." Go to the next slide, please. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. Again, this is not Braveheart that we're talking about here, okay? But God doesn't criticize Gideon's actions of doing this at night, because God is more interested in obedience than he is bravado. Realize this. The Israelites are not completely forsaking Yahweh in favor of idols. Rather, what they're doing is they have combined the worship of Yahweh with idols. They've just put them all together. And these idols were their security blanket, because as they've come into Canaan, this is what the Canaanite people do. Their idols are promises of a fertile crop and promises of fertility for them and their family lineage. Well, next morning, the townspeople wake up. They look up on the top of the hill and they ask, "Where are our gods?" Don Knotts, I mean, Gideon did this. Verse 31 says, "But Joash," now this is Gideon's father, "Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, 'Are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar.'" Sounds to me like Joash may be coming around. He says, if Baal is God, I don't think he needs any help from the town council to maintain his honor. He should be perfectly capable of zapping my son on his own if he wants to. And so verse 32 says, so because Gideon broke down Baal's altar, they gave him the name Jerubbaal that day, saying, "Let Baal contend with him." So Gideon gets this nickname. And this is what it means. Let Baal contend with him. Jerubbaal. I don't know if it's a compliment or a curse. It may be a little bit of both. But after this, the Midianites launch a massive assault on Israel. And again, the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon and tells him to mount a counterattack. Gideon sends out messengers into the surrounding tribes. It's a call to arms, but Gideon is still wrestling with doubt. He's unsure of God's call. He's unsure of God's promise. He is hesitant. He is not unbelieving. Okay? He's hesitant. And so he comes up with a not so bright idea. And it's interesting, some people continue to do this when they ask God for something. And even at this time, Gideon realizes this may not be the wisest thing I've ever done. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand as you've promised, look, I'll place a wool fleece on the threshing floor." Which, interestingly, that's where he didn't want to be before. Now he's out at the threshing floor. "If there's dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I'll know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." And that's what happened. Gideon rose early the next morning. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. Now that's pretty impressive, isn't it? But Gideon thinks, well, maybe that was a coincidence. Let me try something else. So it then says, then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. You see, he realizes this probably isn't the brightest thing I've ever done. Don't be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew. Now, any of you who have ever dealt with wool, you know how unlikely that is, right? If there's moisture around, it's going to zap it up. That night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew. That's where we're going to pause in our story about Gideon this morning. But what can we learn from this story? And I think there's a number of things that are obvious that we can learn life lessons from. The first one being that God doesn't call the brave. He makes brave the called. God never starts with who we are, but rather who He intends for us to be in Jesus Christ. When God called Moses, He said, you're going to be my spokesperson. And Moses says, do you realize I have a speech impediment? And God says, it doesn't matter. You're going to be my spokesperson. He calls Abram, a 90-year-old man who has no children. And he says, no, your name's been Abram, but I'm going to rename you Abraham, father of nations. And Simon, this impetuous, unstable guy, God in flesh says, your given name might be Simon, but from now on I'm going to call you Rocky, Peter. See, here's the thing. These aren't just stories in the Bible. God does the same thing with you and me. God speaks to us when we're dead in our sin. And God says, you are alive in Jesus Christ. The question is, do we believe Him? Do we believe Him in the way that He identifies us? Satan, you see, is the accuser. And Satan wants to start with us where we have been and even where we are. And he wants to box us into that. This is what defines you. Your past and your present define you. God, on the other hand, says, this is who you are, as He sets for us what we're going to be in Jesus. God doesn't call the brave. God makes brave the called. Second, we are the activity of God today. Gideon asked, God, why don't you still do things among us like you did among our ancestors? And God said, well, funny you should ask, Gideon, because I'm here to do some things and I'm going to do them through you. Today, we often hear people say things like, why doesn't God take care of the hungry in the world? Why doesn't God feed the naked? Why doesn't God heal the sick? Why doesn't God bring peace to this unpeaceful world? And God says, funny you should ask, because I'm going to use you to do exactly that. Third, revival begins at home. Gideon's first assignment was to go and tear down his father's gods, the Baals and the Asherahs. Before we can do battle with the enemy around us, we must get rid of the enemy within us. And if you say you don't have any idols, maybe you don't know what an idol is. You see, Gideon's family's idols were not things that were instead of God. They were in addition to God. You with me? The idols were there to ensure the rain and to ensure their fertility. And we might think today, well, how superstitious of them to be putting their trust in gods that are made out of wood and stone. But a better thing for us to do is to ask ourselves this question. What areas of my life, where do I have places in my life that I'm not really sure that I can trust God with? And so I have other things in my life to act as a backup. And I would suggest to you that those things can be idols. Fourth, courage is not the absence of fear. It is following God in the midst of fear. God's one-line answer to Gideon's fear was, I am with you. God's peace comes not by us closing our eyes to the things that make us afraid. God's peace comes to us when we open our eyes to His presence that is with us and around us. Which leads to another question. How can we know that God is with us? You see, this is really Gideon's question in the fleece test. How can I know that God is with me? Which brings me to the final point. The cross is our fleece. Let me explain that. Some people have been critical of Gideon for this fleece test, while other people have continued to practice this kind of thing. Laying their fleece before the Lord is what we call it. But I want you to notice that Gideon was not looking for an answer to option A or option B, like we would do if we laid out a fleece test. Gideon was seeking to understand the nature of God. Gideon was addressing a place where his faith was inadequate, where it was uninformed and weak. And unfortunately, we often take that story and we apply it to laying out before God options in our lives. And so we'll say things like, God, I'm thinking about buying a new car, and I'm not sure if I should, but if you'll make sure that I receive a check in the mail tomorrow for $500, then I'll know that that's your answer to me to buy the car. Or we'll say something like, Lord, if I receive a call between 2 and 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, I'll know that you're wanting me to take that new job. And that's God calling right now for you to take that new job. Here's the problem with something, or one of the problems with something like that. What if the call comes at 3:05? Or we'll say something like, for the young people, Lord, if she smiles at me after class today, then I'll know that I need to ask her out on a date. What if she smiles at you during class that day? You see, that's not the point of this story. That's not what Gideon was even doing. Notice, Gideon, first of all, knew that what he was doing was unwise. In verse 39, he says, don't be angry with me. And again, Gideon's fleece test was not because he was looking to an answer of two options. Gideon's fleece was more like the man who came to Jesus with his son who was sick and asked Jesus to heal him. And Jesus says, if you believe, to which the man said in Mark, I do believe. Help me to overcome my unbelief. This is what Gideon's looking for. I believe you, God. I just want affirmation. And further, you and I have something that is so much better, that assures us that God is with us and that God is on our side, and that is the cross of Jesus Christ. Now, here's what I love, though, about the fleece story. Even if Gideon's actions were ill-advised, and even if our actions and the way that we often bring tests like this to God are ill-advised, God isn't ashamed to stoop down and to reassure us in our fears. I mean, God is the perfect parent. And would we as parents call our 3-year-olds chicken because they don't want to go out in the front yard because there's a pit bull roaming the neighborhood? No, what we would do is we would get down on their level and we would reassure them that they're safe. And God is patient with us in our weaknesses. God doesn't mind bolstering our faith. In fact, God is so eager to do that He has provided for us a table instead of a threshing floor. In that table, we have a drink and we have bread. You see, every week we gather with this reassurance from God. I'm with you, and I will always be with you. And so 1 John chapter 4 says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. And then the psalmist says this, in God I trust and am not afraid. What can man do to me? You see, brothers and sisters, true courage comes from the presence and the promises of God. True courage comes from us embracing our identity in Christ. So don't look for courage to give you your identity in Christ. That's backwards. Look for your identity in Christ, for what He has said you are. Look for that to give you courage. That's our lesson from Gideon today. But every week we take this opportunity at the end of this time to offer an invitation for any who might want to come and be baptized into Christ. A new identity, by the way. Or if you want to come and share a prayer request, and as always, we have an elder and his wife who are available in room 102 if you want to go there and speak with them. We provide you that opportunity right now, and so I invite you all to stand and let's sing.